Con el auspicio de Plenitud, Ciudad de la Alegría, hogarplenitud.org.es, Serenidad Spa Terapéutico, serenidad.es, Permasalud Glamping, permasalud.com.
¿Qué tal, estimados oyentes, y bienvenidos a New Age? Hoy les estaré presentando el tema de las experiencias cercanas a la muerte, con una entrevista con el doctor Eben Alexander, que ha ganado su notoriedad gracias al libro La prueba del cielo. Pero antes de entrar en la charla con el doctor Alexander, con subtítulos en español, te voy a hablar un poquito sobre él. El doctor Alexander pasó más de 25 años como neurocirujano académico, incluidos 15 años en el Brigham y Women's Hospital, el Children's Hospital y la Escuela de Medicina de Harvard en Boston. Durante esos años trató personalmente a cientos de pacientes que padecían graves alteraciones en su nivel de conciencia. Muchos de esos pacientes quedaron en coma por traumatismos, tumores cerebrales, aneurismas, infecciones o accidentes cerebrovasculares. Pensó que tenía una muy buena idea de cómo funciona el cerebro y cómo genera conciencia, lo que es la mente y el espíritu, pero el 10 de noviembre del 2008 entró en un coma debido a una rara y misteriosa meningoencefalitis bacteriana de causa desconocida y pasó una semana en coma conectado a ventiladores con sus perspectivas de supervivencia que disminuyeron rápidamente y con un pronóstico de los médicos de que no iba a poder sobrevivir a esto. Sin embargo, el séptimo día, para sorpresa de todos, empezó a despertar. Los recuerdos de su vida habían sido completamente borrados durante el coma. Sin embargo, se despertó con recuerdos de una fantástica odisea en lo profundo de otro reino, mucho más real y vívido que este terrenal que conocemos todos. Su viaje aportó conocimientos clave para el debate mente-cuerpo y para nuestra comprensión humana de la naturaleza fundamental de la realidad. Su experiencia reveló claramente que somos conscientes a pesar de nuestro cerebro, que de hecho la conciencia está en la raíz de toda la existencia. Su historia ofrece una clave crucial para la comprensión de la realidad y la conciencia humana. Tendrá un efecto importante en cómo vemos la espiritualidad, el alma y el reino no material. Al analizar su experiencia, incluidas las posibilidades científicas y las grandes implicaciones, visualiza una reconciliación más completa entre la ciencia moderna, la espiritualidad como producto natural. Así es que prepárate para esta interesantísima charla y estaremos contigo luego de esta breve pausa. Te agradecemos por estar con nosotros, por apoyar el programa, por compartirlo, por comentarlo y pues gracias a ustedes seguimos aquí. Regresamos.
Síguenos en TikTok, Facebook e Instagram como GoyPazR, Vimeo y YouTube como Radio Serenidad S. En WhatsApp 593-999-203-203, radioserenidad.com. Plenitud, Ciudad de la Alegría, hogar sustituto para adultos mayores. Contáctanos al 099-753-8085.
Estás escuchando New Age, el programa de la nueva era.
Dr. Alexander, why do you believe this NDE happened to you? Is there some sort of destiny? Do you believe in destiny, or why do you think this happened to you?
Well, I think near-death experiences are always ultimately tailored for the individual soul who has them. There's no other big purpose. When you study them in mass numbers, as scientists do today, you start to realize there are incredible patterns, and they can really kind of emerge as hosting tremendous information about the nature of reality and kind of our sense of meaning and purpose in the universe. But they are always just for the individual who has them. So for me, as someone who, for one thing, was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. My birth mother was unwed. And then she wasn't willing to sign the papers to let me go. So I was stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months. And that created kind of a challenge in my life, whether or not I was even worthy of love at some deep subconscious level. And so in many ways, my NDE was set up to help answer that question very strongly in the affirmative, that yes, there was a deep purpose for my life, and that love of the universe was there, even though I'd been abandoned by my birth mother. And also I was a neurosurgeon. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. So I'd always had kind of an interest in consciousness and the relationship of brain and mind and the nature of reality. And my NDE was basically sculpted just to help me come to some of these deep answers. It turns out that, especially when you look at not only the evidence I present, the medical evidence in the book Proof of Heaven, but if you realize there's a medical case report on my medical records that made it very clear that my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, that's where these kind of stories start to have a broader general message. So in other words, the lessons to me, as a neurosurgeon, especially given the extent of my illness and the unprecedented nature of my recovery from E. coli meningoencephalitis in an adult with a week-long deep coma and all the medical parameters that are there in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018 case report on my medical records, it becomes very clear that the brain is not the producer of consciousness. So that's kind of a giant message for me as a neuroscientist, as a neurosurgeon, but the evidence is all there, written all through it. And not only that, but when the peer review editors of that scientific journal that published the case report, when they challenged the authors, the 3 authors who wrote the case report were not involved in my care, but they were fascinated by my recovery that was really unprecedented in the medical literature. And so when the peer review editors challenged them, how do you explain this case? It's unprecedented. They said it's because he had a near-death experience. They knew of other cases of people with profound illness, like Anita Morjani and her advanced lymphoma, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me, and how she had a profound spiritual NDE and then came back to this world and her cancer disappeared. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who wrote the book To Heaven and Back, she had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s. Ended up, that's a situation where any doctor will tell you over 30 minutes warm water drowning, you're a goner. And of course, they brought her to the surface dead, but she was resuscitated and ended up having a full recovery. So these authors knew of these other cases of profound healing in the spiritual setting of an NDE. And yeah, that's of interest to the world at large because it informs us all of a much richer kind of role of soul and spirit, power of prayer, and kind of our spiritual nature to kind of rise above the simplistic falsehoods of materialist thought that put limitations on the ability of mind over matter. And we start realizing that things like placebo effect, spontaneous remission, and then these miraculous healings in the setting of NDEs are simply all methods of informing us of the spiritual nature of our universe and that we're all spiritual beings there. So it was for me, just as NDEs always are. And yet there are general lessons for the world at large that can be very valuable.
So after having your NDE, how did you integrate the experience in your physical life? And how long has it taken you to make sense of this reality, of your experience in this reality?
Well, it's important to point out that one of the main features of my NDE that was unusual. I mean, in fact, I've never encountered this in another NDE to this degree, but I think it was part of that lesson for me individually as a neuroscientist to learn deep lessons about the brain and mind, is my amnesia. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life, no knowledge of Earth, this universe. I really started from an empty slate. It kind of reminds me of a statement by, I think it's Rene Descartes, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if you would claim to truly be a seeker in this world, you must at some point reject everything you've ever believed about it. and start over from square one. And that's what I had to do. In fact, when I first woke up in the ICU room after this incredible spiritual journey that was impossible by the tenets of modern neuroscience, and yet it absolutely happened. I was kind of mystified by it. I tried to tell my doctors this extraordinary spiritual journey. They would pat me on the back. Oh, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Now, that amnesia was still quite active, even though my language, personal memories were coming back very rapidly in the hours and days after I awakened. But it took about 2 months for all of my knowledge, semantic knowledge, neuroscience, cosmology, physics, all of that returned to me, even stronger, the memories more complete than they had been before coma. But that was a long process. It took about 2 months, as I said, for all of that to come back. So initially, I just believed my doctors. Okay, dying brain, tricks, hallucination. I thought, wow, what a hallucination. I remember writing it all down because I really wanted to make sense of it. And very importantly, as I discuss in my book, Proof of Heaven, my older son, Eben IV, was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. He had been at my bedside while I was deep in coma, and he also came home from school about 2 days after I got out of the hospital. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 2008. And I remember giving him this big hug. And he told me later that with that hug and with just seeing me, he said I was far more present than I'd ever been before, that I was transformed in many ways. He said there was like a light shining within me. But I remember telling him, I said, Eben, it was way too real to be real. That's how I interpreted what my doctors had told me about this miracle. And that's what it seemed to me, because the whole journey was incredibly complex, rich, detailed, all of happening, as I would soon find out, at a time when my brain could not have mustered any kind of consciousness, given our notions of neuroscience and the role of the neocortex. Because, it turns out that meningitis is kind of a perfect model for human death because of the destruction that it does to the human brain, especially the neocortex, which is kind of the main engine of consciousness, according to neuroscience. And yet, that was a very deep mystery, how all of that could unfold with all these parameters showing that my brain was in no shape to harbor such a journey. And so there was that incredible kind of mismatch early on. I remember also my son told me, write down everything about your journey before you read anybody else's near-death experience account. That was extremely important. I wrote about 20,000 words over 6 weeks. And only then did I dive into the literature on NDEs, and I was shocked, because I had this beautiful guardian angel, this beautiful woman on the butterfly wing, who was kind of my guardian and escort through all of this incredible journey. And yet, when I came back to this world, I had no idea who she was. And the more I read about NDEs, the more I realized that such a guardian angel should be a crucial person from your lifetime. And yet I had no idea who this woman was. Deep in the middle of the spiritual part of the journey, we had this mind meld where I had witnessed her presence, and she gave me incredible reassurance. It was an incredibly magical spiritual scene where we were together on this butterfly wing, millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling over this valley that had thousands of beings dancing, joy and merriment. And it was a world of perfection, where all the plant life, flowers, blossoms, buds on trees, very rich and lush life. No sign of any kind of death or decay. It was a world of ideals. And to witness all that and get all of those incredible lessons, have this spiritual guide. And yet, if I had scripted the whole thing, what I was beginning to realize in the weeks and months after my coma, when I was reading and studying and trying to figure it out, I realized that there was, if I had scripted it, my father would have been there, my adoptive father. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found in the whole journey. And that was a deep mystery to me. And yet, as we tell in the third book in the series, the third book is called Living in a Mindful Universe. That was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell. And in that book, I tell the story of what happened to me 2.5 years after the coma, when I finally did encounter my father's spirit in a deep meditation. And I'm a big proponent of meditation. I meditate an hour to a day. I use sacredacoustics.com. Anybody wants to learn more about very powerful tools of meditation, go to Sacred Acoustics to learn more. But the bottom line is, he appeared to me in this vision in a deep meditation about 2.25 years post-coma, and made it very clear to me that he could not have been in the journey as my spiritual guide, because if that had been so, in spite of the fact that I had a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, if I had seen my father's spirit there as my spiritual guide, I would have been a little more tempted to just think, oh, it was a hallucination. It was a wishful thinking, something I saw on the way out. And that's why the universe had given me an especially deep dive with the amnesia, but also giving me a spiritual guide that was richly tied to my life, but someone I had never met. And all of that is explained fully in the book Proof of Heaven. At the end of the book, when I find out the identity of that spiritual guide, that beautiful guardian angel, and it brings together my adoption story and that love of the universe, all these elements are then joined together in this powerful, powerful story that forced me to admit the reality of the journey. It seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. But it happened in a spiritual realm that's far more important to us as human beings and as sentient beings. And that was really the gift of the journey, was that beautiful guardian angel, and finally identifying who she was 4 months post-coma.
So this is interesting because you were unable to identify who this angel was while you were having the experience. Yet you knew that it must have been somebody important in your life.
Exactly.
So once you realized who she was, that if you don't want, I'm not going to mention either. But if you once you realized who she was, what I wonder is why couldn't you realize who she was when you were in that state of total lucidity? And you had to go through a process to identify who this angel guide was.
Well, that's a very good question. And I think, to me, the best answer is that I really had to go through this struggle of understanding that came afterwards. So the kind of back and forth between my old materialist neuroscience self trying to pretend, none of this could be real. It was just a hallucination. But the deeper aspect of me that realized that did not answer the question. And I think if I had fully identified her deep in coma, I wouldn't have had the same kind of unraveling necessary when I came back to this world. I can never have a complete answer to that question. It's a deep one that I've pondered many a time myself. But I think I had to go through this kind of struggle, this wrestling match with my old beliefs and my new beliefs that came in the months after coma to really assemble it in a way that made sense to me. So that I really kind of had to come back to this world with that mystery still open as to her identity. And it was by deciphering that mystery in this world that allowed me to follow the little breadcrumbs and come to realize that the only possible conclusion from all of the evidence was that this beautiful spiritual guide was there. She really was, had that role in my life as part of my, my birth family and all that part of the story. And I needed to unravel that after I came back to this world to make sense of it, because only in that way could I get the full power of the story the full power of that message.
In what way then is that realm connected to this physical realm? Because, you had the experience, no? You had a very lucid experience, yet when you came here back and you had to go through a process of tying the knots. I wonder then what's the connection between that realm and this to make it
what I would
worthwhile?
tell you is, what I would say is that realm is kind of a world of ideals, truly, like in Plato, the Greek philosopher of 2,400 years ago. He mentioned that there was kind of this realm that served as kind of a template on which our physical world is based. And I would say that that's very much the way I look at the relationship, that world, the spiritual world, is much more one of kind of unification and acknowledgement of the power of our free will as sentient beings to use this binding force of love and connection, that God force, and share that with our fellow beings. So that world is one that I like to return to through meditation. And I know from doing the workshops that Karen and I have done around the world. Karen's my life partner for the last 11 years. She's also the co-author of that third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which is very, very important. That's the true proof of heaven. That's where we really have, reconciliation, consolidation of science and spirituality that involves quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, non-local consciousness, all of these pieces assembled into a much richer version of reality that leaves that bleak and paltry fiction of materialism or physicalism that pretends that we're just a brain in a body, living birth to death, nothing more. But this really kind of expands our view of self as soul, because a huge part of my understanding from my journey was that reincarnation is absolutely real, absolutely no denying it, period. Even though most of us don't, have ready access to memories of past lives and between lives, but that's because those memories are covered over by natural processes as we go beyond age 6 or 7. To me, reincarnation was a crystal clear part of the package. Without it, you can't explain so many things. And yet I was unaware when I came back to this world of the scientific data that supports reincarnation. In fact, if you go to uvadops.org, University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, for more than 6 decades, they've been studying past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. They've carefully investigated more than 2,200 cases over 6 decades plus. And in those cases, 1,700 are what they call solved. They actually found the person who lived before that's described by the child. Mm-hmm. And so reincarnation, even though most of us don't claim to have those memories, is absolutely a scientifically proven aspect of human existence. And yet our materialist science has no way to explain it.
In Eastern cultures, they don't have an issue with reincarnation. It is more in the Western world, that very materialistic, scientific-based world that puts the limitations on the reality. But Eastern cultures don't have the doubts that we have about reincarnation.
Truth be told, there are a lot of people in our Western culture who suspect that reincarnation is real. And it's because those cases happen a lot. You have a lot of children out there talking about past lives. Now, if you just kind of dismiss it, as a materialist, say it can't be because brain creates consciousness, then you're kind of missing the boat. But if, as these scientists at the University of Virginia and other groups have done it too, Carol Bowman, James Matlock, these people have investigated past life memories in children and proven beyond any reasonable doubt that many of these cases are absolutely real. So when you start studying it, you find the reality is there. It's just like so much of the rest of science is finally waking up to this.
So how shocking was for you being a neurosurgeon, and when you came back and realizing, the time that it took you to put things together and become you again, to realize that the platform that we have created as reality in this Western world, and basically in the whole planet, but let's talk more about the scientific community, where you come from, and the Western platform of reality that we have co-created. When you realize that there's something more transcendental and realize that this reality is just really, as sages have said, pure illusion. How was that understanding for you? Because after all, bringing your message to the world, where still there's a high percentage of people that believe that the reality that we created is the ultimate reality, the ultimate truth, even. How was that change of focus in understanding that this is just an illusion?
Well, it was actually very refreshing. Because when I came back to this world, I'd obviously had a vision that showed me that the universe is far, far grander than this minuscule little kind of awareness we have as a physical being on Earth. But that all the clues are right here, as a sentient being. And it's very refreshing because by opening our mind much more broadly to the possibilities and explanations and accepting the data that, like all these NDE cases studied by the thousands that are out there, it turns out with this bigger theater of understanding that leaves behind that paltry fiction of materialism, it starts to make more sense. And then we can make more sense of our lives. I cannot tell you how many I've received thanks from thousands and thousands of people, including many scientists, nurses, quantum physicists, engineers, doctors, nurses, with gratitude because I've simply opened their eyes to a bigger picture of reality. Now, in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we really get down into the nuts and bolts of the science and the spirituality and how they strengthen each other, because it's by expanding our worldview of understanding and leaving behind that little fiction of materialism that only the physical world exists, that we start to actually get a lot of the answers. Mm-hmm. And so that's why our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is so important. We use there a principle of consilience. Mm-hmm. Consilience is when you look at a deep, deep problem like consciousness, what is it? And you look at it from multiple different kind of scientific and philosophical directions. For example, quantum physics. That is the very beginning of proving that consciousness is primordial in the universe. You look at statements from Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger and Max Planck and Pascual Jordan and others, how consciousness creates reality. The material world emerges from consciousness. They're very clear on this, going back, 100 years ago, that consciousness is fundamental. Now, in the mid and late 20th century, quantum physicists kind of denied that. And they would say, well, we've moved beyond that. We've learned more. But they didn't really. What they actually did, and this is something we discuss in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, was they went through a struggle about trying to maintain that old kind of materialist worldview. And that's what Einstein wanted to support. And Einstein in 1935, he fought against entanglement, the spooky action at a distance of quantum physics. And he wrote a scientific paper called the EPR paper, Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen, in 1935, where they said, I think that hidden variables, there was some kind of unmeasured variable within these subatomic particles that instructed them how to behave. And hidden variables was his way of maintaining local realism. That was kind of the hallmark of science. Local, meaning that all physics is particles interacting with each other, touching each other locally, and that realism is that there's an objective reality that exists out there independent of the observer. And that's what they were trying to do. So in 1964, 30 years later almost, John Bell, an Irish physicist, came up with a way to do experiments to actually say yes to entanglement or yes to hidden variables. And with his paper, that's when the three investigators who won the Nobel Prize for Entanglement in 2022, John Clauser, Alain Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger, started doing experiments, taking that Bell inequality and treating it experimentally. They all expected Einstein to be right. They all expected hidden variables would explain it. But every experiment they did, beginning with John Clauser and then on to bigger and bigger experiments, proved that entanglement was real, spooky action at a distance, this kind of strange connection through the mental layer of the universe that transcends space and time to allow this connection of particles that we can measure in these experiments is a very real phenomenon. And it just said we need a much bigger model of reality, and it's one where mind is primary over matter. That mental field, the quantum field, the entanglement field is that mental field. And that is where we have this influence over matter. And that's why it's so important that 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics for Entanglement says, basically, the Nobel Prize Committee admits that we're leaving local realism in those tenets of four-dimensional space-time that Einstein was so certain would rule the day. And we have to admit that entanglement and that kind of primacy of mind is right there at the core of understanding the scientific truth moving forward. And that's where we are now, is that quantum physics helps to support this bigger reality of primacy of mind. But the thing they lacked, those quantum physicists lacked in coming to this grand conclusion, was they were not given this incredible platter of human experience, like near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near death, but happen to perfectly healthy people, like a loved one 1,000 miles away, who can witness a departing soul, even to seeing their life review and then coming back to this world. And then you have all that evidence from parapsychology of non-local consciousness, things like telepathy. Identical twins have very powerful telepathic experiences. Read Guy Leon Playfair's book, Twin Telepathy, and you realize something like 35% of identical twins have such a strong telepathic connection. If one of them touches a hot stove, the other twin 1,000 miles away will have a blister and feel pain. That is a strong connection. Then you have remote viewing, which is a form of that's been scientifically investigated to show we have power of discernment of information beyond the channels of our normal understanding. And then you combine all of that with these experiences with quantum physics, as we do in our book, Living in a Mind-Free Universe, and you start to realize the one mind hypothesis is true. The notion is that all of the physical world emerges from the mind, and all of our minds are actually connected. It's kind of that God mind that near-death experiencers deep in their journeys encounter this infinitely loving God force at the core of creative reality. That's what gives them so much knowing in this eternity of soul. That's the beauty of these experiences. And yet that one mind is actually at the core of all that unfolds. And yet we are different from each other. So there's the kind of gradation. The analogy I like to use, it's kind of like the facets on a diamond. So the one mind is the diamond, and it's going through this process of evolution and growth and transformation. But every facet on the diamond is the perspective of an individual sentient being that is playing a role in this unfolding drama of all of us interacting with each other using our free will. And I stress that because that materialist science that I worship before my coma would scoff at you for claiming you have free will. They think it's all predetermined chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain and body and the world, following the rules of physics, chemistry, biology, and that consciousness itself is an illusion. That's what the materialist science would try and argue. And yet we realize, no, quantum indeterminacy completely opens the door wide to free will and the contribution we make as sentient beings to guiding to the unfolding of this universe. And you realize that spiritual realm is a realm that's completely outside of our apparent passage of time and earth time. Mm-hmm. And the importance of that is, for example, life review, your life flashing before your eyes, birth, death, everything in between simultaneously evident to you as you go through the life review. It's a course correction. It's instructional. It allows us to grow. And when you realize the life review is actually reflective of your interactions with others from the perspective of all involved. So you don't really kind of own your life review as yours. It shows you how we're all participating in this kind of dream of the one mind in the evolution of consciousness itself. And it's a much bigger, grander vision of the primacy of mind, the interconnection of mind, the binding force of love that is so obvious to near-death experiencers. Those are really the deep lessons to be brought back to this world. So it's time to deny that fiction of materialism that pretends we're separate beings, because quantum indeterminacy and this deep quantum field of entanglement shows that we're actually all interconnected. We're sharing the dream of the one mind, but it's a process of growth. So when I use the term in reincarnation in this setting, it's not like reincarnation, say in the Buddhist sense, where it's a wheel of suffering, you're reincarnated, but you're trying to get off the wheel of suffering. It's about a process of grace, transformation, evolution, the evolution of consciousness itself, a deeper understanding of the universe and our relationship to it. But it is empowered by this acknowledgement that we're all in this together through this binding force of love. We're here to learn and teach and grow. The hardships in life are actually gifts. I came to realize, for example, that my adoption abandonment wound was one of the beautiful challenges of my life that was answered in my near-death experience in a way that helped me come much more into a sense of wholeness and oneness with the universe at large. And so look at those, illness, injury, these challenges in our life as gifts that can allow us to grow. It's how we respond to those challenges that allows us to kind of witness our relationship with the universe and come to see this grander sense of connection. And the more we witness that binding force of love through meditation, centering prayer, different ways of going into mind and exploring and realizing that, our mental experience is not just, something locked in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between my ears, but going into mind means going out into the mind of the universe, which is a shared kind of mental, spiritual space. And that's really kind of the gift. And that's why in so many of our meditative workshops, I know that people who've never had a near-death experience can still have these incredible insights into primacy of mind, their eternity of soul, their connection with loved ones who've already left the physical plane, and a much grander sense of self and who they are in the universe. So this is all about a growth and transformation, a maturation of humanity, of human culture, coming to a deeper acknowledgement of our interconnection and of sharing this kind of free will of sentient beings to guide the evolution of the universe at large.
Wonderful. Let's go for a small break, and we'll be back with more questions with Dr. Eben Alexander.
Permasalud Glamping Lodge te espera en la provincia de Imbabura, en Ecuador, para que te conectes con la naturaleza, recuperes energía y bienestar. Te ofrecemos domos full equipados y carpas de glamping con toda comodidad. Escoge entre paquetes básicos de estadía y paquetes completos que incluyen desayuno y acceso al área de nuestra piscina natural con baño turco e hidromasaje. ¿Necesitas un espacio de paz y tranquilidad? Entonces, este es el lugar preciso. Visita nuestra web permasalud.com o envíanos un mensaje de WhatsApp al 0999-203-203.
Permítenos acompañarte con New Age.
Okay, we're back with Dr. Alexander to continue this amazing dialogue. And in the first part, you mentioned that consciousness creates reality. And I was wondering, what about unconsciousness? I mean, because we will I'll go into ask you more about what consciousness is, but most in the world, most people in the world are very disconnected from who they are and very conditioned by the power of society and what they've been told that they are and everything. So, okay, consciousness creates reality. So what about unconsciousness or disconnection from consciousness?
Well, very good question. And what I would say is, we're used to kind of thinking with our little linguistic brain, with a little, Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe. It's a region about that big. And that's where a lot of our kind of conceptual structuring of the universe occurs, is through language. But I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head the annoying roommate. And that is a very good way to put it. So in other words, that little voice in my head, it's the voice of my ego mind. And the ego really uses fear and anxiety as its main tools. The ego is deeply involved in the toxicity of addictions and things like that. But that little ego mind, the voice in your head, is not your consciousness. Your consciousness is your awareness of that. But that awareness has access to much more. And that includes what you're referring to here as kind of the unconscious and the subconscious. And that's kind of the realm of dreams. That's the realm of much of what gets exposed. For example, when people take psychedelic, entheogenic substances like psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, LSD, et cetera, those substances actually kind of open us into that unconscious and subconscious. You can also access it, through meditation, centering prayer, near-death experiences, shared death experiences. And there are many ways excuse me one second, many ways to access that kind of grander field of our conscious awareness that belongs to us, that goes far beyond that little ego mind, the linguistic voice in the head. So this is where exploring consciousness through meditation and centering prayer is so vitally important.
So what would in this case? I mean, if you go through lucid dreams or you do psilocybin or LSD for therapy to open up to those deeper realms. Okay, so in this sense, what then is consciousness? Because if consciousness creates reality, we need to understand what consciousness is first. But also understand that, I was referring more like to the Jungian collective unconscious, but still, basically, to humanity's unableness to connect to who they are, because we have the ego. So first, I would like to ask you then what consciousness is, and then why do we humans have the ego in the middle? I mean, why would he have ego if it's about living this spiritual reality, which is more transcendental? We are here, and every single person in this planet has an ego. So there must be a reason why ego is part of the journey. But first of all, what is consciousness? And then we'll tap into ego.
Okay, first of all, consciousness is just awareness, awareness of existence, what it's like to be something that is aware of its environment, aware of, and it turns out, part of this is realizing that we're aware of much more than just our physical environment. That's why things like near-death experiences, shared death experiences, especially where, a loved one who is dying 1,000 miles away can come through and take my soul off into this brilliant kind of spiritual realm. That's kind of the bigger awareness. And so the ego is the part, that's that local little piece that kind of protects, the body and kind of pays attention to its nourishment and kind of sustenance and what have you. But it turns out that ego voice can be very limited. And it also can kind of collect trauma, like things like a childhood abandonment wound, other kind of what Karen and I often call baby wounds. Any kind of challenge from our parents and others when we're young often can be buried in the heart, kind of an emotional wound. And we carry those with us. And so they're in that kind of subconscious field. And when I say that, I'm simply talking about an awareness that takes a little more effort to reach than our ego mind. And I would say that animals, for example, are very richly involved in this field of consciousness. So they can have a very rich kind of spiritual awareness. I think anybody who has a pet, dog owners, cat owners, people who love horses, etc., they realize that this kind of spiritual connection goes beyond our linguistic brain and our kind of rational, logical explanations of things, but there's a deeper knowing. It's kind of gnosis, noetics, kind of a sensing of deeper realities about spiritual interconnections at all. And that's really available to us. But for me, I think an example is just how I use my kind of dealing with my ego mind in meditation. What I do is when I'm going into meditation, and again, if you need a powerful tool, sacredacoustics.com with binaural beat brainwaves is an incredibly powerful tool to enable you to put that little ego voice into timeout and start riding the waves of consciousness and expanding beyond the kind of here, now, and sense of self that is really the province of the ego mind. And so my ego can state a request, an intention, ask a question, what have you, early in the meditation. But then I've learned through meditation to put that ego mind into timeout and then allow that expansion across the veil of the filtering function of the brain out into that kind of brilliant primordial mind that is the God mind that we come in touch with in a deep near-death experience where we become one with that loving force of the universe, or what have you. But we can start to approach that and experience it through meditation. But this is always kind of a way of defining that ego mind is a little subset of conscious awareness that's there to kind of protect the body. But like I said, remember that the ego mind is also absolutely essential to things like addiction, to certain toxicities, because the ego uses fear and anxiety to kind of help guide you and kind of govern behavior and performance, all in this kind of often misguided way of protecting kind of the body. And yet the soul is much grander than that. And that's why the soul can witness this kind of expansion through meditation, centering prayer, through being open to these bigger experiences like near-death and shared-death experiences, after-death communications, what have you. And that's where our awareness can become much greater than the ego mind. But I think by becoming aware of the ego, its limitations, its kind of that nature of being the annoying roommate, that helps us to kind of gain this bigger perspective of an awareness that transcends the sense of here, now, and sense of self.
So, okay. So, like, the ego would be more like the lower self, and the soul would be like the higher self from a spiritual psychology perspective. Now, it would seem like as we come from the spirit realm, and we go down to the material world, it's like a dimmer of the light that you go turning it off. And when we are in the material spirit, we have the dimmer of the light very, very little. And it's not that the light of spirit is gone, it's just that it's very little, because suddenly the darkness of the conceptual ego as we know it so far takes over us, because we live a separate life. We understand this reality through separateness, and therefore the ego is the governor of the personality, through emotions, physical body, thoughts. Yet it is part of this reality, and maybe through experiences like you have had and other kind of spiritual experiences, people are uplifted to understanding and transcend the notion that this is the reality and the truth of existence.
Right. Well, I think you're right on target in many ways, and a huge part of this is I can tell you that over 11 or 12 years of meditating every day, my kind of general reality as I walk this world and interact with people and do things and live my life has expanded tremendously to be more of that higher soul, more of that infinitely loving God force manifest in a spiritual sentient being to interact with this world. So just because we're awake in these bodies doesn't mean we're slave to the ego. And this is where meditation, centering prayer, learning more about all of this, the more you read about near-death experiences, the more you start to realize that you're an eternal soul. You're grander than just, a body living birth to death and nothing more. And it's through that kind of process of living this life in a greater, more expanded fashion. And admittedly, I had my near-death experience as a catalyst that would open me up to this grander reality. But all of us, by being conscious beings, have access to an expansion like that. And I know I've seen it in many of our workshop participants who have never had a near-death experience, and yet they can have profound spiritual experiences of engagement where they move beyond the kind of fear and anxiety of the ego and much more into love, into compassion, into kindness, into an acknowledgement of their spiritual essence, being here and open to this kind of God force of awakening that allows us to grow and mature. And I think all of humanity is going through that now. In fact, what I would say is we're at a kind of a fulcrum, a culmination point of more than 5,000 years of human evolution trying to understand the nature of reality. And that finally, with this kind of blending of spiritual and scientific sensibilities in the 21st century, we're able to go to the next level. And in many ways, as we've been pointing out in this discussion, some of the deepest truths of oneness of mind, the binding force of love, and how these are kind of scientifically valid ways of explaining our existence in the universe were truths that were apparent to spiritual leaders, East and West, thousands of years ago. The unity, the Upanishads, for example, were very inspirational to quantum physicists like Robert Oppenheimer. They realized the more they studied modern physics that it was telling them, pay attention to the deepest truths of ancient spiritual traditions because they were right on target. And that's where I think a lot of this is coming together now, is we're realizing that these deep and profound spiritual truths of oneness and the binding force of love and shared meaning and purpose in the evolution of sentience is all part of this awakening. But it involves a deeper understanding of mind and consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, the brain and conscious awareness that kind of expands and shows us that quantum physics is indeed kind of pointing us in the right direction, that there is one mind. We're sharing it. And yet it's that individuality, those different facets on the diamond I was talking about, the diamond of the one mind. Those different facets are what allow for growth and transformation. And if you were to ask, what's the purpose of all this? I would say, essentially, I refer back to the writings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Back in the mid-20th century, he wrote a book called The Phenomenon of Man. And Chardin was a French paleontologist, so he was a scientist who paid a lot of attention to billion-year timescales, but he was also a French Jesuit priest. So he was very aware of spirituality and spiritual matters. And he came to recognize that all this heavy discussion in the mid-20th century of Darwinian selection and evolution of biological systems on Earth was just a tiny picture of what was really going on. And the really going on is an evolution of consciousness itself. Mm-hmm. And that's where I would say we start to get to some much deeper answers, is by acknowledging that these profound truths that are coming into the scientific, philosophical, and theological worlds through common human experience. That's the essential piece to remember, is we have to admit the empirical data of people reporting visions of loved ones who come to them in after-death communications, deathbed visions, all the beauty of that kind of binding force of love and those heavenly realms that are witnessed in these spiritual journeys. We have to build all that empirical data into the bigger model. And that's where our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, goes so far. But also, I would recommend to your to your listeners who want to know more, beyond our book, which I think is a very good starting point, there's a website, bigelowinstitute.org. And that has 29 essays available for free to the reading public right now. And those essays all address the question, what's the best scientific evidence for continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? That question was asked in 2021 by Robert Bigelow, an aerospace engineer in Las Vegas. He had a few $1 million for prize money. And he asked that question because he'd lost his wife, his son had committed suicide. He wanted to know, what's the scientific evidence for whether or not their spirit is really here? And so he put that question out to the scientific community, demanded that anybody who wrote an essay had to show at least 5 years of research experience, investigating the afterlife question. In that setting, he was going to give away 3 monetary awards, and yet the essays were so good from all around the world, proving the reality of the afterlife, that he published all 29 essays and gave out monetary awards to all of them. So bigelowinstitute.org is your repository of such information. When you read it, you'll see essays coming from every different direction. Some are extremely scientific, like Bernardo Kastrup's essay is very, very deeply scientific without appeal to any kind of parapsychological information. You have Julie Beichel's very scientific work on psychic mediums, sensing the spirits of departed loved ones, etc. Hers is a very scientific paper. Dean Radin, Jeffrey Mishlove, who won first place, Pim Van Lommel, who won second place. Tremendous information. And what it does is it proves to you that any scientist who comes to you and says, oh, this is all woo-woo nonsense, there's no reality to it, that they simply haven't done their homework. Because you read those essays, you realize the scientific evidence is all over the place that absolutely, consciousness is fundamental in the universe. Our souls are eternal. We just need to understand more of the mechanism, but the reality of it is beyond any reasonable doubt. And this is where the world starts to wake up to the scientific reality of eternity of soul, the binding force of love, and very comforting facts around the death of the brain and body that show that our connections with loved ones continue beyond the grave.
Well, it seems that science fiction is way more advanced than science anyway, because they show us much more of all the things, all the possibilities that we can consider, and they are not just completely held by the scientific community. But I want to go beyond science, because I do believe that they are doing the best they can, and maybe one day it'll. I mean, there are a lot of people that are working on science and spirituality as the binding force of them, but still we need. There's a greater strength need to be permeated in the whole world before it can be completely accepted, to say the least. But you're mentioning two things that I believe that we need to sort of delve into a little, because you were talking about the binding force of love, okay, and also the one mind, the God mind, okay? Mm-hmm. So first of all, I would like to ask you about the binding force of love, because the love that 99% of humanity experiences is not the love that you experienced in your NDE. Is the ego-centered kind of love of possession, of you are mine, you belong to me, this love, I love my kids, they are mine. So this kind of love, though it's love, it's a very, very like the ego-centered kind of love. Right. So when you talk about the binding force of love, I'm sure you're talking about the unconditional love, yet this is not something most people understand, because we have been trained to believe that unconditional love is the kind of love that parents feel for their children, but there's a lot of conditioning in that love. So what kind of love are you talking about when you talk about the binding force of love?
It's very much, as you say, that unconditional love, because you make a very good point. Many times what we call love in this world has conditions. I love you if. And that, especially in our romantic relationships, sometimes there's kind of give and take that involves that kind of conditional nature. I would say often love of parent for child and child for parent might more commonly transcend that, although sadly, many times those parental-child relationships are kind of lacking of any kind of, unconditional love. But, NDEs, near-death experiences, and similar spiritually awakening experiences often allow a deep dive into unconditional love. And it's because we start to realize kind of the beautiful love in all of us, that every soul is trying to do their best. Now, if they're very ego-driven and narcissistic, toxic ego, et cetera, it's all kind of me-focused and conditional on transactional. I need something from you. But having had an NDE, I realize, and this can also be achieved in meditation and centering prayer, this sense of this grander unconditional love, you start to realize those connections can be very powerful. Certainly, when you experience an NDE and start going into deeper and deeper into these spiritual levels, and there are multiple levels. For me, it ascended through, from the earth, from my view, to the Gateway Valley, all the way up through light portals into this brilliant core realm, which was, the core was a complete resolution of dualities. And that's where all things come together. We're used to this is a world of dualities, masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil. There are always spectra of qualities that give us this gradient that allows us to kind of participate in this world. But the closer we get to that spiritual center and that God force, the more all of that resolves and comes into oneness. And so, for example, when I was in that core realm, that sanctum sanctorum of the divine, the deepest level I went to, which seemed to be beyond that kind of boundary that people often describe in an NDE, but more completely into that oneness of that God force, I came to recognize that God force of pure love was the very source of my conscious awareness. And that only as I kind of moved away from that spiritual kind of center of the universe, creative source of the universe, and that purity of God as source of conscious awareness, did I start to realize that we had things that we would label as good and evil, masculine, feminine, that all those dualities start to emerge as you come away from that world, ascend through the lower spiritual levels, like my Gateway Valley, that had a lot of earth-like features, but also spiritual features. And then you finally get to the densest realm, and that's this material world, where we just have these material bodies. But that's why this kind of exploration of the spectrum of conscious awareness, going all the way to the deepest level of that core, where you have that complete resolution and oneness and binding force of love, is all there is. And you recognize, as so many near-death experiencers have, that is the source of our conscious awareness. And that is also a realm where there's no longer some battle between good and evil, which is only apparent as you get way out here near the periphery. But deep in that core level at the source, it's pure love. There's no such thing as a satanic force or anything. All of that, I think, comes much closer to this material realm. In fact, for me, that earthworm eye view, if I had just gone into that and then come back to this world, I would have had a hellish NDE or a negative NDE. But I think the hellish NDEs are only, for one thing, they're relatively uncommon, probably 5-8% maybe at the most. And you also must realize that a hellish NDE often has the same very positive transformative effects as a positive NDE. So ultimately, they're all about learning these deep lessons. But I came away from it realizing there's no eternal hell. But a negative life review can feel like an eternal hell, especially if you've handed out a lot of pain and suffering to others. If you've been, selfish and greedy, extremely narcissistic, your life review is going to feel bad. And the reason I say that is when you study them scientifically, as Bruce Grayson, a very skeptical psychiatrist who studied NDEs for the last 45 years, pointed out in an article on life reviews in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021, he made it clear that 74% of life reviews, life flashing before your eyes, in an NDE are from the perspective of all involved. So don't go in there expecting that your life review is just going to be your life and the way you witnessed your life. It's very instructive because you also witness what others around you experience based on your thoughts and actions. And you see what that feels like. And so, in other words, the life review is very much like the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the fabric of the universe. Because in the life review, you learn that how you treat others comes back to you in the life review. And that's why for someone like Hitler, the life review would involve, the fact that 53 million people died in the Second World War. He was responsible for that. And his life review is going to involve an interaction with every one of those souls and what they went through. And not just that, but all the other souls involved who knew them, knew of the family story and the Holocaust and what have you. So his life review would not be much fun to go through, having to be on the receiving end of every bit of that. But I do not believe that equals an eternal hell, because that makes no sense from the perspective of this infinitely loving God force at the core of the universe, that there would be eternal hell and damnation for any souls. But it also is important in this discussion to reflect that we do have a responsibility for how we treat others. And that will come at us during that life review. And it serves as kind of a course correction so that in the next incarnations, our soul groups kind of witness these life reviews together, kind of go through the reliving of events. Because another point that Bruce makes in that paper, Bruce Grayson, is that probably 45% or so of people describe a life review as a reliving of the events, not just a remembering of events. So in other words, this should give you a picture of this realm, the spiritual realm, as being extremely powerful. by expanding our kind of field of view, our ability to see our interactions with others, to see our kind of soul line and soul journey, especially writ large across our entire lifetime. That's one of the reasons why near-death experiences are so hard to put into words, because they're about this much grander reality that involves a grander vision. And it's one that's not at all easy to put into words when you come back to this world.
But still, Dr. Alexander, yet, like, when I ask you about the binding force of love, most people, if we want to convey a message or try to help them understand in the rational mind a little bit of the experience of unconditional love, and you're talking about consciousness, then unconditional love cannot be a feeling related to the way we have learned to feel about love. Because unconditional love would be in that realm where you experience the transcendence of duality, which is consciousness. So unconditional love would be more a state of consciousness rather than a feeling for somebody. If it's going to be a binding force of love, it would have to be an energy that goes beyond our separateness. And so only if you have had a direct experience like you have had, you can, or anybody else that has had a direct experience of unconditional love, could understand what I'm mentioning to you, or you mentioned in the experience of pure love as a God or energy. But what could you say to people who have not had an experience that allows them to understand the transcendence of this kind of unconditional love, that's the one that you consider we need to work with, the binding force of love? So how can we help the audience to understand that?
Let's put it this way. I mean, if you look at humanity and all the people on this world, I think you will find a gradation. You'll find some souls that seem to be very early in the game, very narcissistic, self-focused. You'll find some souls that are very, very advanced, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, people who are totally into the higher good and recognize this kind of beautiful sense of a grander love for all of humanity and everything in between. And I would say that our souls are here to progress along that spectrum and to grow more towards this tremendous sense of binding force of love and connection and oneness. And that brings a tremendous amount of peace and harmony to our lives. And I would say that with this great awakening and understanding and unification of science and spirituality, what it's doing is it's allowing individual souls to realize they have the power to really grow into this higher state.
But it requires inner work. It requires that people do their inner work or do their part to reach. It doesn't come just by asking, I want to feel unconditional love. We need to evolve to get there.
Well, you're right. And it comes through personal experience, as you're pointing out. But what I'm pointing out is that it doesn't demand that you have a profound near-death experience. Ken Ring, who was one of the founders of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS.org, back in the 1970s, wrote a paper, I think it was in the early 90s, where he made it clear he had done a psychological study and pointed out that just by reading about NDEs and becoming informed about NDEs was sufficient to open people up to this kind of growth of higher soul. So just having an interest, paying attention, meditation, centering prayer, you start to realize that you start living your life differently. You make different choices, and they become much more aligned with this kind of higher soul sense. I realized, for example, from my NDE, that the problems of this world are not that we don't love our enemies enough or our neighbors enough, but really begin because we don't even love ourselves enough as the kind of sacred, divine, spiritual beings we are. And so kind of being exposed to this thinking, exploring it in your own mind, the way you deal with others, the way you even see yourself in relation to the world at large, allows for growth and kind of transformation and evolution in our thinking. I know that Karen and I have seen it many a time in our workshops where we do meditation. We use sacred acoustics as a very powerful tool. And people start connecting with departed loved ones in very profound ways that allow them to glimpse that grander sense of soul over multiple lifetimes of soul going through growth and transformation. And we start to realize that that loving force can be a tremendous key to kind of point us in the right direction. And it always involves kind of leaving, acknowledge the little ego, pet it on the head, but you can put it into timeout and start to grow through progressive meditations. And then the more of that meditation and centering prayer, it starts to come into your conscious awareness, the way you deal with the world in a normal waking fashion. You realize that you change over time. The more you kind of move away from that toxic little petty, addictive, prone ego mind and start adopting more of a universal mind, one that acknowledges that binding force of love that is so concrete and clear to near-death experiencers. More than 90% of near-death experiencers across all time, all belief systems, continents, thousands of years, more than 90%, many of them formerly atheist or agnostic, more than 90% come back not just believing, but knowing at some deep level the reality of that unifying God force at the core of reality.
Now, there's two things about this. The one is that once you experience the unconditional love, or all the experiences that you had as a teaching through what you went through, how long has it taken you to integrate? I mean, do you embody the energy of that unconditional love that you met, or do you still think that you need to kind of integrate a process, an evolving process in yourself, though you had the experience, which is very lucid and clear, but is there, like in the physical realm, an evolving process to sort of mesh and unite with that energy?
Well, I think there is, and that is kind of what I've gone through. So for 15 years since my coma experience, I went through that initial phase of kind of the up and down, the wild kind of oscillations between my materialist science self and my evolving spiritual oneness self. But then, especially with that recognition and identification of that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing that happened 4 months post-coma, as I report in the book Proof of Heaven, that was the beginning of an ascent, the beginning of a progressive recognition of kind of these deeper truths and kind of a simplification of it. Because the more we look at that kind of binding force of love and kind of soul journey as being here, working on the highest and best good for all involved, it starts to become clearer and clearer as we leave that pathway. That is, resonant and harmonious with kind of our sense of meaning and purpose for even being born into these bodies and being a soul created to live through this kind of process. But this is why it's a combination. For example, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, it's a combination of the big picture worldview items that we argue from, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, quantum physics, etc. But also blended with that, the book involves a tremendous amount of kind of individual instruction for journeying and instructions for meditation, reasons why binaural beat brainwave entrainment that uses sounds that intersect in the lower brainstem can be so powerful at liberating conscious awareness out of the false sense of here, now, and sense of self. So it really involves both kind of this education and deeper understanding of the scientific worldview that's emerging of this primordial mind and how all of us have this power over the emerging physical reality. And kind of a growth in that understanding that comes along with a deeper experiencing of the binding force of love, which naturally comes through meditation, centering prayer, going within in these deep journeys, and basically cultivating a richer relationship with that primordial mind, because that's really what it's all about for each and every one of us as individuals.
Now, the what percentage of humanity is ready to understand and sustain this process and accept to go, okay, I gotta go into meditation, because we are in a transition. We're definitely the reality that we used to know is falling into pieces, and something is unfolding that we still don't know how it will be. But I don't know about artificial intelligence and how much that is going to impact the new reality that we're going to live. But so if we want to create a reality based on love, what percentage of humanity is already holding this in order to create a new reality? Because of what we see in the world happening right today, we would say, oh my God, it's just chaos.
Well, let's make this clear, that a lot of the kind of political polarization and warfare and kind of apparent, fractiousness and breaking apart of the world today, I think, is due to a deep kind of subconscious knowledge in a lot of the fundamentalist aspects of today that their world is threatened. They are going away because this revolution, this awakening is very powerful and profound. Now, right now it's still at kind of a level that's not obvious to the world. You're not going to find it written about so much in the scientific section of New York Times or in Scientific American. And yet there are articles creeping into those arenas that make it crystal clear. Things like reincarnation are real, near-death experiences are real, et cetera. And especially when you then acknowledge that there are polls out there that will tell you that something like 50 or 60% of people in our modern world have had an after-death communication that was so powerful that it strongly suggested to them that they still have a remaining relationship with their loved one who has left the physical plane, in spite of what, the materialist science and the culture at large will tell them. So these experiences are quite common. And that's why in many ways, near-death experiences are out there probably in somewhere around 5 to 8% of the population. Something like 20% of people having a cardiac arrest will have a near-death experience where they have a spiritual awakening experience. It shows them that their material worldview is no longer adequate. So just the prominence of these experiences in the population ultimately will drive it. Now, in the 20th century, I was part of the materialist neuroscience, et cetera. I was trained that way. And we would dismiss the data. We said it can't be. And that was the dominant storyline in the media. But the good news is in the last decade or two, there's been an increasing number of scientists who realize that all of this is absolutely real. And they're building a much bigger story and sense of understanding. So this revolution, a paradigm shift, is impending on this world. It's deeply dependent on the science because the science shows us that pathway and how it all can be real. But ultimately, it's those individual experiences of near-death experiences, after-death communication, deathbed visions. And these are not just in the NDE community. For example, Christopher Kerr, at Hospice Buffalo. He doesn't care about NDEs, but he wrote a great book on terminal care and hospice and what they experience. These people all go on to die. And what he confirmed in his book, it's called Death is But a Dream, Christopher Kerr, Kerr, came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And he makes it clear that the very same things that near-death experiences are reporting, especially encountering souls of departed loved ones in a very real fashion, often involving information that proves to you it's not just wishful thinking, but is a true spiritual contact from that departed soul, you start to realize there's more and more evidence that builds onto this emerging story of the primacy of mind, the binding force of love, and these kind of spiritual truths that are scientifically validated. And it starts to help us answer a lot of questions. And that's why neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, non-local consciousness, quantum physics, all of these human experiences showing this kind of grander aspect of this infinitely loving universe, and not just a cold mechanical universe, are really what will guide the way. And it's kind of a combination of forces of the scientific understanding and kind of worldview shift, combined with the millions and millions of personal experiences that support this reality. And instead of denying them as we used to do, the scientific community is now embracing them and using them as the empirical data that helps support our rational argument and kind of emerging worldview. That is why the world is changing. But don't be fooled by the frenetic pace of fractiousness of the news media and all those headlines popping up about the crazy people in this world and the hatred and violence and all that, because ultimately there's this gigantic revolution of human thought that is emerging right beneath that will become much more obvious in the coming decade.
Yeah, that's true. Let's go to another small break, and we'll come to talk about the one mind God and many other interesting subjects with Dr. Eben Alexander. ¿Qué tan valioso es el programa New Age para ti? Desde 1988 hemos ofrecido música, contenido para el despertar de conciencia, introspecciones guiadas y entrevistas a personajes destacados. Ahora te ofrecemos opciones en distintas plataformas para que lo escuches o lo mires a tu propio tiempo. En estas épocas de grandes cambios, participamos con energía, decisión y temas importantes para sacudir la conciencia que te apoyarán en esta transición planetaria. Te invitamos a convertirte en patrocinador de New Age con el monto mensual de tu preferencia. Tu contribución es muy importante para la continuidad del programa. Puedes aportar a través de PayPal o transferencia directa a nuestra cuenta bancaria. Con tu patrocinio, cubriremos los gastos de producción, plataformas pagadas y nos ayudará a expandir los mensajes que ofrecemos. Agradecemos profundamente tu apreciación por lo que compartimos. Estarás presente en cada programa.
Abre las puertas de tu mundo interior y permanece con New Age.
Dr. Alexander, as with love and this notion that most people have experienced the ego-centered love, because that's the easiest to understand. My question for you would be the same about God, because the idea that most people have of God is based on the religious training of their ideas of what God is. But because, before monotheistic religions, there were pantheistic notions, there were many gods and things like that. But in these 2,500 years or 2,000 years, more or less, monotheistic religions have taken over the idea of the one God. And people look up to God. Oh, God, solve my problems. Oh, God, this. And, oh, God, I give you my problems. You solve them. And something idea of God that is external to us. But when you, the word God, per se, the word God has been really diminished by religions. And so my question to you, the first question regarding this subject is, when you refer to the one mind and the God mind, what is this? In what way this breaks the religious notions of God?
I defer completely to the world of near-death experiences. And what you'll find is in near-death experiences across all cultures, all religions, all belief systems, point to this universal, infinitely loving God force. It's all about the higher good. And that God is one that's not judgmental, but is this beautiful sense of love at the source of all consciousness. And to me, that's a very important distinction. I will point out a book that was written by a friend and colleague. His name is Robert Koppes, Coppes. It's called The Essence of Religions. He's very, very educated about near-death experiences. He lives in Holland. And this book, he uses near-death experiences as the gold standard to teach of an infinitely loving God, because that's the matter that's what comes back to us. That's what NDEers experience and talk about and discuss. And he compares that gold standard of an infinitely loving God force at the source of our awareness, never separate from us. And he compares it with Christianity, with Islam, with Buddhism, Hinduism, and with Judaism, with the 5 main faiths of the world today. And basically, the NDEs are the gold standard. The life review, as we discussed earlier, is absolutely critical to get this. It shows us we're sharing the dream of the one mind. We're all in this together. It's all about that love we share for our fellow beings. And the ultimate form of that love is unconditional. I often say the love of the creator for the creation, because we're co-creating. That God force being right at the core of our conscious awareness means we're co-creating with that God force our emerging reality. And so it's a way of, in essence, saying that we don't have to depend on 2,000-year-old scripture to define our relationship with this infinitely loving God. We can experience it in the here and now through meditation, centering prayer, through having NDEs, shared death experiences. All of that contributes to this kind of deeper understanding of that one mind and God force. But that ultimately, it is something that I think the NDE community shows us is about an evolving consciousness. Just like we said earlier, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, it's that evolution of consciousness itself towards this oneness with the divine. That's exactly what the process is. It involves multiple lifetimes. That's why you must admit to the scientific evidence supporting reincarnation, but also acknowledge that this is a much bigger vision of reincarnation that involves oneness and the highest good, and this kind of unconditional love becoming the rule by which we live and govern our lives. And it leads to a lot more harmony, peace, and resonance in this world.
Definitely. But most people, governed by their religious belief, they are looking for this God outside themselves. I mean, as I told you, God give me this, or God. Since we are so ingrained in the separateness, and that's how we view life, through separateness. So we believe that this God is outside of us, and most people don't look for the God inside of us. They don't look for the light of the God inside. So, would you think that the way to connect to this one mind that you are referring to, this God love, is to look for that love inside oneself?
Yes, very much. But it's also through kind of expanding our sense of self. As I said earlier, don't continue to perpetuate the myth that you are that annoying roommate that's inside your head, that little monkey mind, that chatterbox of anxiety and fear, the ego voice. That is something that needs to be acknowledged as only a minuscule part of who you are. And that's why this kind of knowledge of the one mind and the connectedness we can share through meditation, centering prayer, to traverse this veil. Because what happens is the brain is not the creator of consciousness. It is a transceiver, a filter. There are many different words we use to describe it, but it's not the ultimate creator. In fact, its main mission in many ways is to suppress kind of the spiritual awareness and kind of keep us in that ego mind in the here and now, take care of the body, nourishing it, sustenance, etc., procreation, those kind of pieces, but not this grander kind of spiritual sense of self with a grander spiritual mission in the universe to grow through this kind of admission and expression of unconditional love. So that's why I think, this discussion and these kind of points help each and every one of us to start expanding our sense of self. And you're right about love and how it's often still very restricted, especially by those who are slaves to their ego, narcissists, etc. And yet, by hearing this kind of discussion, people start to recognize that they can be more than that. And that's where I think this whole revolution in human thought can be so valuable. And that's what I think is unfolding now. And that's why I think we're seeing all that kind of panic in some of the fundamentalists, because they realize that false sense of separation, that comes from that outmoded materialism or physicalism, the scientific view that only the physical world exists. But we know that's not true. Entanglement, the Nobel Prize in Physics 2022, makes it crystal clear we've left behind that myth of the false sense of separation that materialist thinking in our culture leads us to. And now it's quantum informed. that involves a grander one mind, that God mind, where our brain serves as a transceiver that allows a little eddy current of that primordial mind to exist in our existence while we're here in these bodies. But even in meditation and prayer, we can realize that that eddy current is only an apparent reality. It's a maya. It's not the ultimate deeper reality that we can explore by exploring consciousness itself.
Okay, but now, the monotheistic religions have an idea that we are made in the image of God. So they believe that God has some form, some human form. I mean, that's how it's transmitted, right? When you experience this one mind God, this experience, did it have a form or was it energy?
No, it was a pure force of awareness and love.
Okay.
It was not like I was talking with a person. It's not like that, but it's actually much better. It's a deep form of kind of spiritual home. It is a resonant center of peace and pure harmony that is right there at the core of our conscious awareness. It involves acknowledging that who we truly are is not something that's birth, death, nothing more, but is far grander than that. So the entire sting of death, the kind of that a lot of the apparent illusion of this world and kind of the interchange of our ego and how it, demands kind of conditions on love, etc. All that starts to evaporate as we realize that materialist model of a separate being that has no kind of overlap with our fellow, sentient beings is false. And that's where we can start to grow more into this wisdom of the one mind and the binding force of love, and how it helps us become much more comfortable with our spiritual home and realize that is a realm of eternity. That's why the life review allows you birth, death, everything in between. A life review can even involve seeing into past lives, seeing into potential future lives, etc., putting this much bigger story of an evolving soul into reality. But we must step away from that false sense of separation, the little ego that points that is traveling through this earth time, and recognize that it's a far grander theater of operations. And that's what allows us to expand into acknowledging that infinitely loving God force as the very core of our conscious awareness.
Now, do you believe that the experience you had, the level or the dimension of the experience you had, is you said you went through several levels, right? Do you believe there could be higher realms beyond the one you experienced, maybe like the ones that enlightened beings experience, like the Buddha and other enlightened beings? You feel that there could be higher realms beyond the ones you experience?
Well, I can't say. All I can say is what I experienced. And certainly when I compare it with thousands of other experiences that I've studied, that I've talked to the people who had them, et cetera, because thousands of people have volunteered their experience to me. So I've had many, many personal conversations that allow me to try and dissect that out. There's often discussion of a boundary, that's uncrossable. But I feel like for me, that boundary was what I encountered between the Gateway Valley, which had a lot of earth-like features, but rich spiritual features, et cetera, as I describe in Proof of Heaven, and the next level, which was an ascendance. It was a vision of seeing all of the material space-time collapsing down, all of the spiritual realm with a different ordering of causality that I call deep time or metatime, all of that collapsing down until I entered that core realm. It's hard for me to imagine that there would be much beyond the core, because for me, the entire universe throughout all of eternity was there as this complex oversphere, as a teaching tool for what I experienced in the core. And the core I can best describe is a complete ocean of this infinitely loving God force that I oscillated in becoming, not as an ego, forget ego, but this pure spiritual sense of oneness with that divine as the source of my very creative spark. It's hard for me to imagine there would be something beyond that. And I would say most of the the conversations or all the conversations I've had with others, et cetera, suggest that that is kind of the sanctum sanctorum of the divine, that there's nothing more necessary to explain it all, but that all of us are on these soul journeys that involve multiple lifetimes in approaching that golden core. In fact, I had a vision, even though I could not have an Eben Alexander life review because of my amnesia, I could witness life reviews, reincarnation, every bit of it in these giant visions I had in the core realm. The most extraordinary one is what I call Indra's net. And that was a vision showing all of our interwoven threads of our lifetime. It's almost like breathing. So the inhale is being in a material body, living a lifetime. Exhale is between lives, life review, reuniting with loved ones, etc., planning next incarnation. Then an inhale, and I saw this weave of the threads of this incredible tapestry, all leading towards a golden center. That to
sort
me,
of like the black hole in a event horizon. It's like
it's very
core.
much like that. And yet all of this was, to me, it was the evolution of conscious awareness throughout all sentience, throughout all of the cosmos, evolving towards this oneness with that God force of pure love and consciousness. So it's an evolution.
In this idea you have of the whole cosmos, the notion of extraterrestrials, life forms in other places, is part of the cosmic game.
Absolutely. And I mentioned that in Proof of Heaven. I mean, I witnessed civilizations far advanced beyond this world that are all part of the same process of growth, transformation, all evolving towards that oneness with the divine purity of that God force of love. And it's really that gradient that drives our evolution, our transformation. It's what makes our lives interesting. It's what allows for our free will to dictate the evolution of reality in the physical world, all being driven by this kind of world of ideals I've been talking about.
So, as you mentioned, that there are different civilizations that higher and maybe lower. It seems like it's a cosmological game, like where different levels of awareness in different kinds of life are leaving their level of awareness so they can eventually go back to the light or go back to the source or go back to the I don't know if it was you mentioned it was obscure, it was dark, but
I would also say in many ways that God mind is evolving. It is not a fixed, perfect endpoint. It is something that is evolving. That's why mind, free will, change, evolution, upshift. I mean, every bit of it is about progress.
Why do we have it so hard? I mean, we are not the body, we are not the thoughts, we are not the emotions. But why are we so stuck with the identification with this physicality that impedes us or doesn't allow us to realize that the source of our spiritual essence?
Well, I think it's because it gives us skin in the game. And that's what allows, if we had complete and full knowledge of everything our higher soul knows from all of its evolution to date, especially all this knowledge of eternity of soul, and that death of the physical body is simply an illusion. It's not really the end of soul at all. It's the end of a physical body. But then you realize that quote end is spread out completely. So birth, death, everything in between and beyond becomes evident to us in these deep dives into these spiritual journeys. That's when you start realizing it's a far grander game of evolution and understanding, learning, teaching. This one mind is something that is going through all this for a purpose. And I think that purpose is to a deeper understanding of itself. But it's not as if that perfect understanding is there. It's following this wave of evolution of sentient beings in this discovery process, in evolving towards what it's evolving towards. So that's why it's a much bigger thing that doesn't just involve, we're going towards just oneness with the divine, that's independent of its kind of purpose of evolution and growth. And I think that's a very important kind of piece to get, and it points out the importance of free will and quantum indeterminacy.
Now, regarding reincarnation as part of this evolving of the soul or just the life process, I'm sure people want to know about, reconnecting with the souls that they have experienced in their lives before, because in your case you didn't even know about this being, but it was part of this angelic being, but it was part of your life, whether you knew it or not. So do we reconnect with the same souls over and over and again? Or now, there's the idea of the twin flames, which is a one soul, which is, it is a very powerful experience as well as soulmate, which is a different experience. What would you say about this?
Yeah, well, what I would say is, to kind of picture the growth of the soul is like trying to imagine the sound of one hand clapping. Doesn't happen. Soul growth is always involving all the souls of the soul group evolving together, learning, teaching. I believe there's a lot to this notion of soul agreements, that we come into this world with our soul group and we plan hardships. We plan ways that we're going to help each other. We plan ways that we can learn and teach to evolve our group to a higher knowledge of these kind of principles and understandings. And I think a lot of that occurs in that world, but important to point out that our actual growth is what happens in these bodies living these lives. Now, the life review between lives is kind of like a course correction. It enables us to kind of smooth off the rough edges with our soul group, plan next incarnation so they'll be most efficient. But ultimately, I believe that it's evolution of that group, which then, of course, like that old saying, all politics is local. All of cosmic evolution is nothing more than sentient beings and soul groups coming to a deeper understanding of their shared meaning and purpose and their kind of shared ability to manifest the evolving reality of their kind of ideals. And that's why that bigger picture is so important. But I think there's a lot to that notion of soul agreements, soul contracts, some people say.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, to end this conversation with you, which was very amazing, what was the most significant teaching you received from your experience?
Well, obviously the brain doesn't create consciousness, but it's the other way around. That, for me, as a neuroscientist, was gigantic, absolutely critical to going anywhere with any of this. And then an evolution of deeper understanding of what that cosmic mind, that God mind, is truly all about. Why does it exist? Do we have any true ability to manifest free will and evolve? I mean, all of those kind of parts of this discussion, recognizing the importance of resonance, of kind of information overlap with loved ones. That's how we kind of identify and find these common threads in the spiritual realm, is through this kind of deep principle of spiritual resonance with our fellow beings and soul group. And it's really just a very liberating, kind of expansive vision of who we all are and what humanity is, and a recognition that spiritual reality absolutely includes, the rest of the world. The universe is in consciousness, in this one mind. And that is where I think our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and similar books like Steve Taylor's Spiritual Science, Larry Dossey's beautiful book, The One Mind. I mean, all of these start making a critical scientific exposition of the oneness of consciousness and how this apparent kind of separation into these little eddy currents of consciousness that we seem to have and own are kind of obscuring the deeper truth of the connectedness of mind and consciousness through the binding force of love. That has been incredible.
Would you believe then that like Eastern thoughts or Eastern philosophy, like Taoism, for instance, who talks about the Tai Chi and beyond the Tai Chi, which is the Tao and everything, they have a clearer picture of what you have experienced?
I'd say in many ways, yes. I wouldn't say clearer. Let's say we're all getting to the same notion of oneness and love, and that spirit is the ultimate guide of what unfolds in the material world. So to me, the magic of the moment is that science, which is a beautiful way, the scientific method, scientific community. I mean, the scientific community has plenty of faults because they're human, but the scientific method is very valuable, especially when you realize that it's more than just the material world. Quick example, if under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, people can have profound phenomenal experience. Well, over the last few years, there have been scientific papers that have proven that under the influence of serotonin 2A entheogen drugs like psilocybin, DMT, that's ayahuasca, LSD, etc., the brain goes dark. The brain is not doing it. The brain is getting out of the way. And we've shown that scientifically. So if you want deep answers to what happens in these profound spiritual experiences under the influence of psychedelic substances, do not look to the material techniques of examining the brain. You won't find it there. The brain's getting out of the way. So this is simply informing us that these kind of questions, about consciousness and about phenomenal experience and about soul and spirit demand a much grander theater of operations than materialist science. But science can address it. When we move beyond with careful investigation of these cases, you take all of these stories as important information. They contribute to the evolving scientific worldview. And of course, that's where Living in a Mindful Universe, our book from 2017, is very important. But likewise, a lot of the other resources I've mentioned, BigelowInstitute.org, all of that is very important evidence. But if you don't start investigating it, don't claim to have a deep understanding of all this.
Mm-hmm. Are the soul and the spirit the same thing, or are they different levels of manifestation of that life?
I would say soul is just what we use as kind of common reference to the spiritual aspect of us as soul lines, but that spirit is the grander ocean of interconnected souls. And I've become very much a lumper, not a splitter, in these definitions and understandings, but really just focusing on kind of the unity of consciousness and the binding force of love.
Yeah, and I ask you because, as I mentioned to you before, that feeling of like the dimmerizing of the light, the one spirit, as we come down to different levels of manifestation to the physical realm where duality is inevitable, like it's like the dimmer of the light, and there's a reason. We need to work, as you've mentioned, on ourselves to evolve, to understand the transcendence. Because when you experience this transcendence of the spiritual realm, there's an understanding that peace, love, liberty, all is one energy. It's not divided. We divide them here, and we understand liberty one thing, peace is another, inner peace or whatever. But, in that level of understanding, it's all one energy.
Well, you're right on target. And to me, it makes infinitely more sense to look at all of this and all possible permutations and analysis, et cetera, as being a top-down causal realm that comes from that God force and kind of the will of this kind of emerging sentience, especially as it divides out into all the apparent separate minds that are never really separate. But that's what is really driving it, is that dynamic, interactive energy that is driving this evolution.
It would
thank
be
you
so,
very much.
Yes, it would be just so amazing that the whole world would understand this, and that we can come together in this binding love of energy, because what we experience right now, and I understand it's just inevitable, the part of the crumbling of this realm. I just hope that what emerges is a lot better than what we're seeing, experiencing right now.
It is. Our discussion shows it is. Mm-hmm. So, Goy, thank you very much. It's been a joy talking with you. I have great hope and optimism for where the world is headed, but that is all rooted in a knowledge that this awakening is happening, and I am convinced it is. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you very much. Until the next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Plenitud, Ciudad de la Alegría, hogar sustituto para adultos mayores. Contáctanos al 099-753-8085. Permasalud Glamping Lodge te espera en la provincia de Imbabura, en Ecuador, para que te conectes con la naturaleza, recuperes energía y bienestar. Te ofrecemos domos full equipados y carpas de glamping con toda comodidad. Escoge entre paquetes básicos de estadía y paquetes completos que incluyen desayuno y acceso al área de nuestra piscina natural con baño turco e hidromasaje. ¿Necesitas un espacio de paz y tranquilidad? Entonces, este es el lugar preciso. Visita nuestra web permasalud.com o envíanos un mensaje de WhatsApp al 0999-203-203. Con el auspicio de Plenitud, Ciudad de la Alegría, hogarplenitud.org.es, Serenidad Spa Terapéutico, serenidad.es, Permasalud Glamping, permasalud.com.